They say the building was emptied in a hurry. The gates were left chained but unlocked. The final nurses carried out boxes and blankets as sirens faded into the fog. The town below the hill turned its face away and pretended not to hear what thumped through the night, the slow, patient rhythm of something left behind. He didn't know when he went up there that telling this story might draw that rhythm closer. He didn't know that what he'd found that night would awaken something ancient, and that it listens for its name like a dog in the dark. But he would learn. He would learn the language of heartbeats. He was not the kind of man who believed in curses. He was the kind of man who believed in keys. His backpack carried 3 flashlights, a recorder, spare batteries, a crowbar. He knew the dates, the names, the rumors. He knew the red brick asylum had been founded in the late 1800s, expanded after the war, shuttered in the 90s without ceremony. He knew people called it Grayhaven, though that wasn't the name engraved on its arch. He knew of the wing where they say people went in and didn't come out. He knew of the doctor who measured silence, who listened to the echoes inside people's ribs and claimed he heard an extra beat, a persistence after the end. He didn't know, when he pushed the gate and heard the chain whisper over rust, that the story wasn't over. He didn't know the story had been waiting for someone like him to turn the page. He started up the hill at dusk. The grass was unbeaten but tall, brushing cold against his legs. The asylum rose with the slopes, a mouth without teeth, its windows black and its roofline jagged. The sky had the color of a bruise. Wind slid over drains and into cracks, and the building exhaled in long, slow groans that could be mistaken for human voices if you wanted to believe. He paused once and listened to the insects stutter in the weeds, and a little farther on he thought he heard something else, a steady thud below all the other sounds, like a drum too large to see. He told himself it was his own pulse pounding in his ears. He told himself that because it was the safest thing to tell. The doors were plywood and spray paint, but the side entrance was a steel rectangle with a busted latch. He squeezed through and let his eyes adjust to the inner dark, tasting the hospital air still trapped inside decades later. Antiseptic gone sour, old paper, dust with a metallic edge that coated his tongue. The floor was ground glass and peeling tile. The corridors bent the way bones bend after they've healed wrong. He clicked on his light and the beam picked out colors that had been hidden for years. Faded acupuncture charts, a mural of hands rising from a green meadow, a sheet of safety glass crazed with cracks like a spider web. He took a breath and he recorded. "Second floor, administrative wing," he said, as if the building required catalog numbers to be known. "Approach time, 19:52. Air is still. Smell of phenol. Mild drafts. Temperature dropping. Sounds faint. In the distance, a pipe coughed like an old man. He smiled to himself and felt the tiny buzz of achievement. He had entered. He had claimed the space by naming it. He did not see that the naming claimed him back. He walked with care, picking his steps so that the rhythm of his boots did not drown the other rhythms living in the walls. He paused at each open doorway and shined his light in, letting the rooms tell him their history. A ledger room with shelves collapsed under the weight of years, ink-stained boxes wide open like museum cases. A day room painted the same gentle blue as kindergarten classrooms. The paint turned to scales and lifting off in curled flakes big as fingernails. A nurse's station still holding a jar of cotton balls that had turned to a fine grey powder that drifted when he breathed near it. On the floor below that jar, someone had written a date. On the date, under the dust, was a smear the colour of dried meat. He moved on. The first rat appeared only as sound, a light skitter behind, the rustle of paper. He turned, and the beam picked up a tail sliding into a vent. He recorded softly, "Fauna present, standard." There was a comfort in naming still. There was comfort in pretending someone would hear him later and say, "There it is, the exact moment." He thought that was why he spoke aloud, for future company. He didn't think about what else might appreciate a running account. At the far end of the main corridor, there was a staircase that descended like a throat. He knew from the maps he'd studied that the basement housed the mechanical rooms and some storage. He'd read rumors of a sub-basement that didn't appear on plans, a place nicknamed the Quiet Hall. He decided not to be theatrical. He decided to be methodical. He went down. It was colder there. The steps turned wet, and the handrail tasted of iron when he touched it. His light found a curtain of pipes overhead, some bare, some wrapped in oily insulation that flaked away under the beam like ash. The floor held puddles that reflected his light like eyes. He spoke into his recorder again and listened to his own voice come back delayed and low, as if the building had a throat that mimicked. Air moved here, just enough to make the hair on his arms lift. It carried a smell like pennies in a mouth, and underneath that, the sweetness of rot pressed thin by time. He followed the hallway to a heavy door, painted the same institutional green as the day room upstairs. Its edges were scarred where a lock had once been. He touched it and felt a faint vibration, as if the metal had a heartbeat of its own. He laughed without smiling. He told himself it was a generator still humming after all these years, or water hammer in the pipes. He found a pry point and leaned in with the crowbar. The door gave like damp wood, and he slipped through. When it closed behind him, the echo traveled down the hall like a stone thrown in a long, dark river. He was in a low chamber filled with machines from a different vocabulary, ranks of metal cabinets with dials like watch faces, switchboards with rows of toggles, black cloth wiring that drooped in lazy loops. The floor was checkered linoleum, buckled in hills that made walking like sailing. There were chairs with straps. He paused on that and let out the breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He didn't have to guess what those were for. On the far wall, above a sink with two knobs and a rust blossom in its basin, hung a framed poster behind glass, perfectly preserved by the seal. The poster showed a heart, not the cartoon heart with scalloped curves, but an anatomical drawing, labels in elegant script, veins and auricles and ventricles arranged like rooms in a mansion. A fingertip had smudged the glass at the lower right, long ago, in a crescent like a smile. Next to the poster was a corkboard with neatly pinned rows of index cards. He leaned in. Each card bore a name, a date, and a single number coded in red pencil. Many of the numbers were the same, 72, 72, 72. Some, in the same neat hand, were circled and underlined. 142, 38, 0, with a question mark. He recorded softly, patient index, heart rates. His breath condensed on the glass and vanished. He felt the silly urge to rub the names with his sleeve and see if the ink would glow. He resisted. He moved on. In the room beyond, the floor was different. It felt softer. His boots sank a little and came away with threads clinging to the rubber. He directed his light downward. Tacked to the linoleum were dozens, then hundreds, of strips of ribbon in a dark brown color that might once have been red. They were arranged in parallel lines like staff paper. His light followed them to the baseboards. There, where wall met floor, the ribbons disappeared into hairline gaps, as if the building had been sewing itself to its foundation. The air changed. He did not hear the change as much as he felt it. A pressure in his ears and behind his eyes. A tilt, as if he had stepped onto a ship without noticing. He swallowed, and the swallow echoed. He would tell himself later that the first thud he heard at that moment was from his own chest, too loud in the silence. He would say that because it's reasonable to assume your own body is the loudest thing closest to you. But the next thud didn't line up with his pulse. It came as he exhaled. It came when he wasn't ready for it. It made the ribbons twitch. He stood still and turned in a slow circle and raised the light just enough to see the walls. The paint had peeled here in vertical strips, revealing another layer underneath that wasn't paint. It was a rough grey material with fine pores, like pumice. He noticed, because they caught the light, that the pores were not random. They were arranged in loops and branches that looked a little like the drawing on the poster. Vessels. He stepped closer, forgetting to breathe, and set his palm against the wall. It was not cold. It was not warm, either. It was alive in that non-temperature way of a cheek pressed to a sleeping arm. He took his hand back and wiped it on his jeans, without knowing why. He turned off the recorder. The click of the button was loud. Then, in the sudden dead sound, a new noise rose, like someone whispering through cloth. The ribbons on the floor trembled again. The wall under his hand gave a small shaking sigh, as if a sleeper shifted. He thought of the dates on the index cards. He thought of names. He thought of a door with straps and a generator humming and a stairwell that swallowed sound. He thought, briefly and with a bite of shame, of turning back, of choosing not to know more. Then the curiosity that had always been his compass reasserted itself. He raised his light and moved on. The hallway beyond the soft room had no numbers posted by the doors. The doors had no handles, only keyholes with missing keys. Some doors were ajar, but blocked by something just inside that pressed against the gap like flesh. He did not try to open them further. He didn't have to. He could hear what was inside. Not voices, not breath, but that same thud repeating, slow at first and then faster from different rooms, each a different pace, each a different wave. It was like standing in a forest full of enormous animals sleeping under a thin layer of dirt. He found himself matching his breathing to the closest rhythm, because trying to keep his own pace made him dizzy. He came to a room at the end of the corridor. The door was not a door, quite. It was a set of double panels with windows at eye height, the glass frosted. When he approached, he saw that the frost pattern was not frost. It was a film of something that had dried in lacy webs, and underneath that, the blur of movement. He wiped a circle with his sleeve and looked through. His mouth dried and tasted of pennies. The room beyond was full of jars, not mason jars for preserves, laboratory jars with thick bullseye glass and metal lids bolted down with wing nuts. They were arranged on shelves that reached to the ceiling. Each jar was filled with a preservation fluid, once clear, now the color of tea. In each jar floated gently the thing he did not realize he had been expecting to see until he saw it, a human heart. Some were small and tight as a fist. Some were large and loose, with flaps that drifted when currents passed. Coiled within the fluid, threaded into the meat, were more of the dark ribbons, passing into each heart like leeches, coming out the other side and disappearing into holes bored into the shelf. The shelves hummed, the hum synchronized in waves that rose and fell. On the near leftmost jar, a label, patient 3027, age 16, rate 72, status compliant. He stood as long as he could stand. Then he stopped standing. He found his knees under him and the gritty floor in his palms and the foe. Dust there had a smell that made him retch, though nothing came up. He leaned his forehead against the cool of the glass and then jerked back because the cool flexed. He pressed again and felt it, that give, that subtle animal resistance. He laughed, and the laugh sounded like sobbing because it was too close to the edge. He spoke finally to the recorder that he didn't remember turning back on. "Cataloguing," he said, in a voice not his own. "Organ storage beyond operational period. Mechanical. No, that's not mechanical. Not mechanical." He swallowed. The sound of his swallow traveled around the room and was answered by a ripple in the jars. He knew then, not with his mind but with the small old parts of him, that the asylum had not been abandoned. The people had been removed from their rooms like furniture taken to the curb, but the essential part of them had been integrated into the building, the way ivy integrates a wall. Every room he had passed had been a part of a system, and the system was the thing beating. The system had learned to eat boredom and silence and the migration of small animals through its vents. It had learned to pulse in the absence of caretakers. It had learned to wait. The wing nuts on one of the lids had corroded so deeply that the metal beneath had expanded and cracked the jar's rim. The crack ran like a tooth mark. Fluid had leaked there and dried in a brittle collar. Something inside the jar had scarred against the glass where the crack ran. He found himself reaching out to trace it, and then stopped, and then did it anyway, because his body did not believe that something in a jar could touch him first. It didn't. Not that time. Something else did later, when he followed the ribbons out of the jar room and down another hallway and into a narrower space with no ceiling to speak of. Only the underside of the main floor with its joists like ribs. Here the floor was bare concrete and pocked. Here the air tasted different, cooler, fresher, as if it had not been breathed 1,000 times before. He thought this meant he was closer to an outside wall. He thought of that as safety. He did not notice at first that the ribbons on the floor were now joined by thinner threads that clung to his boots, and that as he walked, tiny droplets rose on those threads, the way dew rises on spider silk when the sun comes up. He did not notice because he was looking ahead at the glow. It was not electric light. It was the color of light that passes through skin when you press a flashlight to your palm. The glow came from a room that had no door, just a half-height partition to keep someone in or out. He stepped over the partition, and the glow climbed his legs like a tide. He stopped. He should have stopped long ago, but he stopped here, suddenly and entirely, because this room was the heart of it. The floor was a shallow basin. In the basin, flush with the concrete, lay a disc of a material he could not name. It was not metal and not stone. It had the texture of bone, if bone could be polished by water and pressure for centuries until it became almost soft. The disc pulsed, not with a visible motion, but with a suggestion, as if the air above it breathed. From the edges of the disc rose columns, thin as wrists, made of that same material, and lines threaded between the columns and into them and out again, looping and twisting in a geometry that would make a mathematician cry. The glow came from those lines where they were bared. When he crouched and lifted one gently, and found that it moved with resistance, he saw the faint striations in it that told his brain, against all reason, a single terrible word: tendon. He knew then what it was, not in any clinical way, but in a gut way that made language turn sick. It was the building's heart. The patients had been recorded and removed and bled into the walls not by accident, but by experiment. And the experiment had achieved a single monstrous success. A communal organ, a civic muscle, trained to go on. The building had been learning to live, and he was in its pericardial cavity, and it knew he was there. He set the thread down as gently as he would set a hair down on a sleeping baby's forehead. He stood very slowly. He meant to leave, as if the leaving did not matter. He meant to be a shadow with soft feet and no voice. He meant to put the stories back in his pocket and carry them out and pretend he had stolen nothing. But then the small, stupid human part of him that had to test everything made him do one more thing. He tapped the disc with his knuckle. The pulse faltered. There was a gap. The gap was an abyss. He heard in that gap a sound like a held breath approaching panic. The lines rose in 1,000 small arcs. The ribbons on the floor lifted as if pulled by tide. An extra beat slammed through the room so hard it made him cough. The cough had a taste, his own blood on his tongue. He ran. He ran with the reserve of a man who has not used running as a verb for years. He ran as the unseen lung of the building took an extra breath. He ran through a corridor that he did not recognize, and past doors that had not been there, and up a staircase that had become longer while he was away from it. He ran and the sound behind him was soft, not like footsteps, not like wheels, but like a wet cloth dragged very fast. He turned his light off so that he could not see it. He turned the light back on because the dark is worse. He smashed his hip into a gurney and tasted more pennies. He arrived at the soft room, and the wall there was not a wall anymore, but something that would have been skin if skin were a building. It trembled with his approach. It trembled with his retreat. He spoke without realizing he was speaking, saying please, as if the word had agency. He made it to the stair. He went up 2 at a time and tripped and rolled his ankle and kept going with a noise that he would not have recognized as his voice if anyone had asked. He could hear it now clearly, the way pain clarifies. The building's overall beat had risen to meet the beat of his body. It meant to fold his rhythm into its rhythm, the way water folds a dropped stone into its surface. He reached the steel door with the broken latch and threw his shoulder against it, and felt it resist like a muscle resisting fatigue, and then it let go, and he spilled out into grass and cold air and moonlight. He did not stop. He did not stop until the body of the asylum was a block of shadow at the top of the hill, and the road was under him, and his lungs were ripping at his ribs like desperate animals in a trap. When he finally stopped, in the lee of a stone wall with lichen soft on its crown, he leaned hard against it and felt stone, and felt for the first time since he'd gone in a surface that did not answer back. He put the recorder against his lips, not to record, but like a talisman. He listened with every nerve for pursuit. There was none. There was, however, something else. It is the part of the story that the fire always leans toward when it is told. It is the reason the title has the shape that it has. For a long time after he left the asylum, he could not sleep without adding a pillow over his chest, as if to muffle it. He told himself, in daylight, that of course he was spooked. He told himself that strange acoustics, old biology, human cruelty, and neglect can invent a lot of horror in the body that walks through them. He told himself that the jars had been a prank by someone with access to a medical supply company and too much time. He told himself 100 things. But then, as he lay there in his apartment 3 nights later, his hand on his own breastbone, he felt something that was not his heart. He did not feel it with his fingers so much as with his nerves, with that part of the animal that senses weather and danger. It was a second beat. It did not match his. It was softer and slow and patient. It had been waiting. It landed in the space between his own lub and dub, like a coin landing in water. He didn't tell anyone. He joked to himself, aloud, so that he could pretend he was only telling a story about palpitations, about panic. But when he lay quietly, he could hear it, sometimes in the wall behind his bed, sometimes in the floor near his toes, sometimes in the pipe that ran to the sink. He would turn the faucet, and it would be there in the rush for 1 second, that rhythm that his ears now recognized as a location and not a sound. When he went to a different room, it moved. He would say it was impossible if you asked him. He would say it while he made sure to keep his shoes by the door and his bag packed and his devices charged. He would say it while picking at the skin by his nails, the way someone picks at a scab they know will bleed. He would say it as if saying it could keep naming the safety he needed. On the 6th day after Grayhaven, he woke to find his mouth full of the taste of old preservative, the kind that turns clear to tea, and his tongue felt heavy as if it had been soaking. He spat, and the sink water took the taste away, and then brought it back. He leaned his forehead against the mirror and watched his own face turn into a stranger's. He watched the pulse in his neck. He watched another pulse appear in the skin below his collarbone, a soft lift and fall that did not match the first. He pressed into it, and the pressure met pressure. He took his hand away and stared at the print it left, the 4 pale arcs that filled with color like technique drawings in a textbook. He started to talk in his head to the other, beat the way you talk to a pet you didn't plan to have. He asked it questions in the night, and then laughed at himself, harder than he'd laughed in the jar room. And then he stopped laughing because he discovered that the other beat could be answered. Not in words. He would set his palm on the wall and the beat would move to his palm. He would step back and it would wait. He would go to the hall and it would take 6 seconds and then appear in the baseboard by his left ankle. He would, once, put his ear to the floor and hear a whispering that was not speech, but had the shape of speech, a pattern and a patience. It was like listening to a story told in a language close to his, just one vowel off. He moved apartments. He thought geography would matter. He walked the boxes to the new place, and the new place smelled like fresh paint and someone else's coffee and dust his body didn't know yet. He sat on a box and listened. For hours there was nothing but his regular life. A bus went by. A neighbor coughed. His stomach made the long wail song of hunger. He fell asleep in the blue light of his phone without planning to, and he woke to the sound of the new fridge's motorcycling. And behind that sound, beneath it, deeper than the hum of the city, there it was, the second beat. It found him like water finds the lower place. He stopped recording. He stopped visiting his forums. He stopped returning calls. He started to walk instead. He walked the city in big loops that he justified as exercise. He chose blocks with brick. He chose alleys with old walls. He stopped at buildings he could not have named and felt their skin with his palm, like a man feeling for rain on a leaf. He found now and then that some buildings did answer. Not all, not most, but some. Some had a low, slow pace that made his breathing change. He thought of how long a city keeps secrets. He thought of how many places receive what grows out of what was done to their most helpless people. He thought of water lines and steam lines and foundation lines and lines that were not laid by any part of the human trades. He returned once to the hill. He told himself he was returning to prove he had not joined the kind of people who make pilgrimages to the edges of their own worst nights. He told himself he was going to stand at the gate and make a gesture only, like a kiss blown to a grave, and then go back down. He did not believe himself even as he parked at the turnout and watched the mist drag itself across the grass like a sheet. He went up at dusk again, because dusk had been the time before. He did not bring the recorder. He did not bring the crowbar. He brought only a small blade knife and a little plastic bag for nothing in particular, and his keys. The chain had been wound more tightly. The chain had gone from whisper to hush. He did not go through the gate. He went around. Brambles grabbed at his jeans like hands that didn't want to be hands anymore. He hissed when one drew a thin line of blood across his calf. The sting spoke with the same accent as the taste in his mouth that first morning. He found the side entrance. He pushed. The steel held. He pressed his ear to it. The beat behind it was as clear as standing with your ear against someone's chest while they sleep. He whispered something without knowing he was whispering. The whisper sounded like "let me in." The steel unbent. He did not celebrate it. He didn't even notice the moment when the threshold lengthened and then retracted to allow him. He went in and down until the air changed and the ribbons found his boots again and the rooms off the hallway thudded each their own name. He went until the jar room's glass fogged under his breath and he could read the labels. Not just numbers now, but the names the index cards had borne, typed in a neat hand, the kind that comes from a woman who meant to get out of that job in 1 year and found herself owning it 30 years later. Names like M. Lafferty and Luce, again and again, because there are a lot of Luce in the world. He put his hand on one jar, and it turned not colder, not warmer, but attentive. He went to the basin room. He didn't turn his light on because the glow sufficed. He stood at the edge of the disc and let his own rhythm settle. He stood longer than he had meant to. He stood until time took on the texture that it has right before sleep or after sex, the smoothness without landmarks. He took the small blade knife out of his pocket without really thinking about his hands doing it. He put the tip against his fingertip and pressed until the dark rose and the droplet gathered and fell and landed on the disc and sat there perfect for 1 second before it was not there. The room did not jump. The room did not jerk. The room simply received and altered itself as if one infinitesimal grain had been added to a scale. He felt in his chest the second beat move 2 notches closer inside his body. He gasped at the intimacy of it. He laughed at what the laughter made him feel ashamed of. He took the plastic bag out of his pocket and held it like he might hold a sandwich for a kid. He put it down on the disc, and the bag was a wrongness that made the lines rise in delicate arcs, like hairs on a forearm. He took the bag away. He thought of evidence the way cops think of evidence. He thought of the limits of what a person can prove. He thought of what is owed to the dead. He thought of the right to tell a story. He thought of how stories require the kind of proof you can taste and smell and touch, as much as they require names and dates. He put the knife away. He did not feel the touch on his sleeve until the touch had already passed through the cloth and resolved itself as pressure on his skin. He leapt back, because he is an animal after all. He shone the light then, and saw nothing but the room he already knew. He laughed in a way that had too much edge on it. He stepped forward again, as if to prove he did not believe. The pressure moved to his wrist, polite as a patient in a doctor's exam. He held still and let it. He said "okay" aloud, like a man concluding a long argument with himself. The story can be told to hear in a dozen different ways. The oldest version says that he put his other hand down voluntarily and let the 2 pressures coincide, like palms pressed together in prayer, and in that instant he understood language. He heard words in the rhythm that had been only beat before, and the words were not words, and he believed and became something else. The meaner version says that a thing came out of the floor and dragged him under, and he was never seen. The official version says he vandalized a state property and then fled and then was arrested in a different matter years later, and is uninteresting. The version he told once, when he was too tired to filter and too scared to keep it all inside, is mine. It is the one I offer to the fire now. He did not go under. He did not become a priest in a church with no roof. He was touched. That is what happened. He was touched by a building, or by what a building had grown to hold, and the touch was not hate. It was not anger. It was attention. It was so much attention that it rearranged what he thought of as his outline. He left with his outline a little melted. He left like a person who has been held for the first time in a long time, and did not know how badly he'd needed to be held until he had been. After that, the line between his own heart and the other beat became unreliable. Some days it seemed like the 2 pulses shared an understanding that did not have to be spoken. Some nights it seemed like the other beat rode his like a rider on a tired horse. He would be washing dishes, and he would find himself counting in 3s instead of 2s, and then he would stop counting because it made a sound in his throat that made the room answer. He would be at a crosswalk, and the signal would coincide with something that wasn't the signal, and he would look up, and the building across from him would seem to breathe out and in against its scaffolding with a motion too slow for the eye and too sure for coincidence. He started to think of those people in the jar room as not dead and not alive. He started to think the word still was not an adverb, but an adjective. They were still here, still in. Stillness as a form of endurance. Stillness as the opposite of absence. He said nothing of this to anyone because there is no place for sentences like that in the places people go to drink coffee. Listen. The part that matters to you, to any of you, is not whether he bled into a machine or whether the building learned to eat wounds. The part that matters is this. The thing has an appetite for attention. that is slow and patient and human as famine. It is polite, it waits, it learns your schedule, it notices when you listen, it notices when you tell, it notices when a name is spoken aloud in a voice that carries. He did not understand that at first. He did when the letters started coming in the mail with no return address and only a line of numbers inside. 72, 72, 72. He did when the walls of his new apartment didn't answer him one night, and then did. And when he pressed his ear, he could hear not one beat, not two, but many, arranged in tiers like choral parts, some rising and some falling, and some holding the center like a baritone that never tires. He did when he woke with both hands pressed against his chest with the little childish hiss of pain people make in dreams. He did when, on a train passing under a hospital, every phone in the car vibrated at once and then stopped, and in the pause he could hear it. That patient drum, asking without asking, begging without voice, come back. He did not go back again. He couldn't. He tried to be ordinary with an extra beat set in him like a coin behind the plaster in a pocket wall. He tried to be the kind of man who talks about taxes at the barber and yields the floor in the grocery line and learns names at the gym. He tried to tell the story as something that had happened to a man he knew. He tried to move it 3 feet away from himself in the telling. He discovered that the telling brought it closer. He discovered the oldest rule of the haunted, that the story is also the door. He told it to me once. That's why I tell it to you now. He told it to me because he could feel it in the room when I came in. He could feel it perk up at the cadence of my speech, the way a sleeping dog twitches an ear when its name is almost said. He said, "Don't," and then he told me everything, like a child showing a scraped knee, as if by showing it they can keep it from hurting worse. He described the leathery feel of the ribbons under his boots. He described the jars without embellishment. He described the touch like a hand, but not a hand. He looked at his hands while he talked as if they might explain why they had reached out. When he finished, the room felt fuller. There is no way to explain that will not sound like a mood. The air felt attended to. He glanced at the wall to his left and then down, and then he moved his chair an inch farther from the baseboard, and then he sat forward and put his elbows on his knees as if to guard the place in the body where the pulse lives. He said, "Lo, they're still beating." He meant the jars. He meant the walls. He meant something else. He meant that the line that should have sealed itself shut when the building closed had been kept open by attention, like a wound kept anxious by fingers. He meant that the people who had been removed were still present, and that presence required nothing from us but the simplest of actions: to listen, to lean toward, to put your palm against a wall and wait. He meant that once you've listened once, you have been polite, and the thing will not forget your politeness. I left his place with my breath too shallow and my neck hot. I walked home without touching any wall. I slept with my hands under my hips like a binding. I dreamt of knotting veins like a fisherman knots lines so the fish cannot get away. I woke with my heart too fast and the second beat slow and patient as rain. I lay still until my own rhythm obeyed. I did not speak the name of the place. I forced myself to think of a different hill, a different building, anything to keep the geography from snapping to like a dog on a chain. And now I tell you, and I know what that does. I can feel the room listening to you, listening to me. I can feel it perk up as your attention tightens in the way that attention tightens around danger, told in the right voice at the right hour. I can feel the space between the floorboards, measuring the weight of our fear. I can feel the air leaning in, and I can hear something else. It's small, for now. It is polite. It is the start of a second beat in this room, not aligned with yours, not our shared drum, but a separate, patient one. He didn't know that what he'd found that night would come to live in stories more than in rooms. He didn't know that the oldest houses in any town can learn to listen to a tale and then introduce themselves with a thud, a soft knock in the baseboard where no door ever was. He knows it now. I know it now. In a minute, after you go from here, from this fire, from this video, from this voice, you will know it too, if you don't already. You will wake, maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, and you will put your hand on your chest and count the old reassuring rhythm, lub-dub, lub-dub, and then you will hear a third sound, softer and slower and patient as forgiveness, and it will not be in your body. It will be in the wall near your bed. It will be in the pipe that runs under your floor. It will be under your pillow when you press your ear to it. That polite persistence, that persistence that belonged to the people who were taken out of the building and folded into its architecture and taught to wait. When you hear it, whatever you do not say the name of the hill, do not name the building, do not tell it you understand, do not apologize as if you have done something wrong by listening. If you must speak, speak in a language that muscle does not know. Speak about the weather. Speak about what you will have for breakfast. Speak about anything but heart. Because the truth is that every patient at the abandoned asylum still has a beating heart. And the building learned to share. It learned to send its rhythm out in threads as fine as hair through the attention we pay it. Through stories told low at night. Through your ears and my mouth and the space between. And red brick is only one kind of skin. Plaster is another. And drywall. And the inside of a car door, and the air over your bed at 3:03 in the morning, when you wake and hold your breath and listen, very still, for a sound that has been waiting for you to be quiet long enough. Do not turn the light on when you hear it. That is my last kindness to you. Do not get up and press your palm to the wall. Do not count aloud. Do not set your teeth on any word that might be a name. Let it pass like a train passes in the distance, and do not wait up. If you are lucky, it will only pass and never arrive. If you are not, you will not need my voice to tell you what happens next, because you will have another voice of your own. The voice of attention answering attention, of beat answering beat, of a story waking up near your bed. And when it wakes, it will be very polite. It will wait for you to finish listening before it begins to speak.